Hey everyone, welcome to the Retro Aesthetic panel. I think the way we'll start is just by introducing ourselves. Luke, you want to start?
Sure. Hello everyone, my name is Luke Johnston. I am a virtual reality developer based at the University of Maryland. We've recently won Reality Hacks and Best Film, Art, and Gameplay at our research day at UMD. I have business cards up here. If you want to talk about VR and how that relates to the past aesthetics and future aesthetics, I'm here to talk.
Cool. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out. My name is Eugene Myers. I write as E.C. Myers. I primarily do young adult science fiction and fantasy. These are my books. Fair Coin is my first novel. It's not about like the Bitcoin alternative. But if you buy this book with a fair coin, I want to hear about it. And my most recent book is Against All Silence, which is a sequel to The Silence of Six. It's about teenage hackers. This one, they discover a government conspiracy to cover up efforts to manipulate elections through social media, which it turns out sometimes actually happens. So, like many people here, I also like live stream video games, like mostly like NES stuff, just kind of for fun, not trying to make a living at it or anything like that. But yeah, glad to be here.
Cool. My name is Meg Eden. I teach creative writing at the university level, and my novel Post-High School Reality Quest just came out, which, as you can tell from the retro synthwave kind of cover, is very 80s nostalgic, and it's about a girl stuck in a text adventure game.
My name is Vincent Kuyat. I'm a game developer that has participated in multiple game jams, including Ludum Dare and Global Game Jam. I have completed Ludum Dare multiple times, including more recently I did Small World Online for, I think it was the 15th anniversary or something like that, which dealt with addiction to video games. I also created a board game at Global Game Jam here at MAGFest a couple of years ago that won Best Design for the judges at this location. I've also been accepted to get a master's in game design at American University.
Cool. So to get started, I think it's probably helpful if we define what exactly we think of or what we mean by the term retro aesthetic. Does anybody want to start?
40s is too far back.
Are you sure?
But is it though?
Like what about Cuphead? That's in the 30s. Ooh. And it's very
yes, Fleischerman cartoons. That's late 20s, 30s. Yeah, maybe past 19th century. That's too far. Right, and then you go. You would describe it as Victorian. I think people have that stamp, like stamped as Victorian. Yeah,
like the Bird Lawyer Simulator was Victorian kind of.
Yeah.
Or like The Order
Aviary
1886,
Attorney.
if anyone played that.
Which I guess that would be more Victorian rather than retro, because it used all that old art.
Yeah.
And then where does that borderline with steampunk? How does
That's what I'm wondering.
I mean, Victorian era is steampunked if you just add pipes and steam.
And ears.
I have a few more technical ways of defining retro aesthetic, which are basically centered around the idea of pixel art, which isn't necessarily the entirety of retro aesthetic, as we've been talking about with like Cuphead. But I would define it maybe as art that's low resolution, 16 by 16 pixels, 32, maybe up to 128 by 128. You can also go with restrictions that are like actual 16 bits of data, like back in the Super Nintendo days, or 8 bits of data, like in the Nintendo Entertainment NES days. They had very limited amounts of data they could use to define the colors on screen. And you could restrict yourself to that or make for the actual consoles like they are selling in the dealer's room. You can also restrict yourself to specific palettes of colors. I know things like, I think the Commodore 64 had very specific colors you could use and nothing else. It wasn't defined by 8 bits or 16 bits. It was just that was what was available. So, I mean, that's the basics of how I would describe retro pixel art from back in those days, but you can do other things like Cuphead and go for other types of retro feeling or nostalgic feelings in a game.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about it is that the definition of retro, or what you identify as retro, changes as time moves on. So I used to watch a lot. I used to listen to a lot of oldies, When I was a kid, that meant like music from the 50s or 60s, and now people mean like oldies is music that I grew up with from like the 80s and the 90s. Like I used to watch old TV shows on like old sitcoms on Nick at Night, which I don't know if you remember that, was like on Nickelodeon. Yeah. And now they're showing things like The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, and that's considered like an old show. So, you know, recently I saw that there's like some games that are actually like kind of diving into the like the N64 kind of polygonal retro aesthetic, which is a different type of aesthetic that you know isn't quite pixel art, but like you see it, you know it. It's like this kind of janky graphics, like you know, like they were really trying hard. It was really impressive at the time, but like anything that doesn't look clean and modern and like cutting edge, like what we've got now, you know. So it's just interesting, like you know, retro in 20 years is going to be Mass Effect, you know. So, you know, like I listen to the Retronauts podcast a lot, and their definition is usually something is retro if it's at least 10 years old, or you know, or older. So it's just something that you see it, like you know when you see it, right? So.
Like the beta version will be called the retro version.
Yeah, and like with that, I think there's almost like some element of restriction. Like you talked about really specifically with pixels, and I think going into the past, you are adding restrictions for yourself. So like Vince and I do text adventure things, which is restricting how you're making a game to purely text. And yeah, that's what that comes to mind. Yeah.
I think I'm seeing more that people are defining, like they're sort of qualifying what they mean by retro. So then they say 8-bit retro or 16-bit retro. Like sometimes you'll see somebody who's like, oh, look at this 8-bit version of Game of Thrones, and then people start commenting like, actually, that's 16-bit. Like, Super Nintendo graphics, like things like that, where you know now there's like retro is just its own sort of genre, and now you have to qualify it, and you have to say like it's you know. And 64 retro or whatever, and you're using like these PS1 retro, which I guess probably just looks like crap. I mean, you know.
So I guess to add to that is not just the idea of low amounts of polygons for any given model, but I think you can probably ape the actual how things looked for things like PlayStation era or PlayStation 2 era, because I feel like those games, especially early on, had a kind of certain feel to them that you don't have necessarily unless you deliberately go for that feeling when you're making your models. I mean, Guitar Man has this, I feel like kind of exemplifies that kind of weird feeling that PS2 era games had in the early days. That you could do that, or you could even try and ape the mechanics of the time. Like games had tank controls back in the day, which are kind of viewed as pretty bad now, but what if you tried to do that? Or tried to restrict how somebody played a game in order to make it feel like a specific type of retro game.
These controls are broken on purpose. Like, sorry.
Silent Hill.
A feature, we
like,
swear.
It's like you know, like I'm primarily into like 8-bit like NES stuff, and we see flickering sprites. Like that's kind of a shorthand for that era of gaming. And sometimes like you have something like Mega Man 10, Mega Man 9, which is now itself retro because it's been long enough. But you could turn that on and off if you wanted to make it like authentic. You were like, okay, I want it to look like bad on purpose. You know, people add scanlines to things. Arguably, you're making it look worse, but that's part of the retro aesthetic for a lot of people. Like they're remembering like the CRT like look of these things.
People actually make games that deliberately try and look like CRT screens.
Yeah, like Super Win the Game, I think. Where they actually, like they try to make it look like the rounded edges and the particular like bloom of the CRT and all this stuff. Like you can get really nerdy about that stuff.
Actually, what's fun about, since you bring up CRTs, games back in the day were designed for CRTs, so they look better on a CRT because the pixels kind of like smudge a little bit together, and they have this particular feel that they were designed for, that when you play it on a legit CRT, it looks actually slightly different and better than if you're playing it on like a flat screen where everything is really crisp.
I guess the next point I wanted to ask about, which we're kind of bringing into, is that this is back in style, this whole retro aesthetic thing. So why do you guys think that is? Like, is this just a trend, or is this really like an art form that's going to remain? And if so, why or why not?
I have. I can add a few things here real quick. One is the challenge of it. Programming for older hardware, or even restrictions on the size of sprites you can put into a game, forces you to think in different or and highly creative ways. Because of the limitations you have imposed on yourself, like if you're programming for the SNES, you have, I don't know, a few kilobytes of memory for how much you can store things. So you got to get real creative for how you even just program that, because the actual code could stop fitting into the cart itself if you put too much in.
So you have to be really purposeful about like what you're doing and how and why.
Exactly. You have to be very purposeful and very careful. Another is practical reasons. It can be easier to make something that looks retro than it is to make a high fidelity game, just because 3D games are more complicated to program than 2D ones. 3D models that look really good can be harder to make than 2D ones that look really good. There are exceptions to this. Please don't take that as like a hard and fast rule. Owlboy and Iconoclasts took 10 and 7 years respectively to make, and those games look gorgeous, and there's a reason they took that long. Another is just out of a sense of nostalgia, like you want to bring back a feeling that you had as a kid. And you want somebody else to experience that and feel similarly to how you felt. Or just because you really appreciate that art form. You really like how that looks, and you want to create that because that is enjoyable for you to see. I guess those are some basic things I can think of.
So I want to bounce off real quick what you were saying about recreating an experience, because I think a few games recently have done that in a really cool way. So I think of like FNAF with the little Atari mini games. To me, that recreates, especially because that game is so much, at least for, there's the whole interesting thing of why kids don't find that game scary and adults do. And I think part of why I find it scary is because it puts me back into the place of being a kid. Those Atari graphics remind me what it was like to play a game as a kid, and the unknown and the mystery, the lack of details that are there are making me as a player put in the details myself, which is engaging me as a player and is kind of making me feel a little bit more immersed into that fear and that unknown. And another one, what is that one that we've been playing?
Which one?
Lone Survivor.
Oh yeah,
Lone Survivor is
Haven't played that in a
another
while.
one that I think does that, where it's all in 8-bit or 16-bit, I guess.
Probably 16-bit's probably the better description of it, or even 32-bit with just low res art,
Yeah.
rose sprites.
Yeah, so like a step up. But the monsters that are chasing you, what makes them terrifying is the absence of detail, because then I'm having to kind of think to myself, what does this thing really look like? And it's terrifying. So, yeah.
It's scarier to fill in the details for yourself than to see the details.
Yes, it's making you a participant.
Yeah. Resident Evil 7 is scary for approximately 2 or 3 times when you see the monsters, and then you're like, I'm over it. Unless it's VR, then it's probably still terrifying.
Yeah.
I'm not touching that any...
Duck season.
No, I'm not touching horror games in VR, like, ever. I can't handle it.
Make sure your heart works well.
Yeah, for real.
I don't remember the author of this article or like the title of it, but I read an article a couple years ago, I think, it was talking primarily about filmmakers, and the theory was that when people start creating work, like people have a professional career and they start making things, that there's like a 30-year window of nostalgia that they tend to go back to. So you go to the 80s again, and you get a film like Back to the Future, and that's like heavily into like the 1950s,
Yep.
you know. And now we're seeing things from the 80s and the 90s, you know, again, sort of that 30-year window. And so I think that translates over to novels, like you get something like Ready Player One, or you get books where it's not such an intentional thing, like you just have somebody who they're just kind of awkward about their writing. That's a different panel. But you know, people start putting in like references, like pop culture references that they remember from childhood without, you know, justifying it in any way. And it's like, well, that makes it feel kind of dated. But I think that people are trying to recapture that either to make other people feel that, but then also for themselves in some way.
I think, Meg, you mentioned this in a previous discussion, that there's like a disconnect between the familiar and the unfamiliar with retro. It's almost like like in Stranger Things, like if somebody's watching it from a younger generation, they're like, oh, this is almost like another world. This is like another dimension. I don't relate to this, but it's familiar enough that I'm intrigued and I'm drawn in. So
It's this crazy world where they don't have cell phones and there's no flat screen TVs.
But what makes, I think, that so successful coming out now is because there is a generation that time is familiar, and then that's blending in with the surreal and the extraordinary of these monsters. So there's that nice balance of familiar and
who knows, maybe the Emoji Movie might fit in there in 20 years.
No. Bury that movie, pretend it never existed.
What emoji movie?
Yeah, what are you talking about?
Do you want to take comments? Yeah.
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah.
I think one of the most interesting things for me about pixel art is that it allows you to see the specific brush strokes, as they happen, individual pixels of what the artist has done. And that's something I don't get a lot of. It allows you to really look at it and feel the love that the artist has put into their works.
Yeah.
Great
Okami did
point.
that very well.
Yeah.
With the brush tool.
Oh, yeah. But now it's in HD. So. But no, I totally agree with that. Like, I love animation, and like most animation now is CGI, like it's computer generated. Unless even I think even the Ghibli films, like the Miyazaki films, are kind of more computer generated than they were. But if you guys have watched. Do you guys know like Aardman Animation, like Wallace and Gromit? So they did Wallace
Chicken
and Gromit,
Run.
like The Curse of the Were-Rabbit, and that was all done totally with like clay models, the way that they had done the TV show. But then you have the same studio, Aardman Studios, also did like Flushed Away, I think,
Oh, yeah.
and it's the same style, like the character designs are the same, but it was all computer generated, and it's very different. If you're watching Wallace and Gromit, you can see thumbprints
Yeah.
of the people who made this film, as they positioned the characters, and there's something about that. So there's something about knowing like this animation cell was drawn by hand, like 10,000 times by some guy like in a room somewhere who didn't sleep for like the last week, versus somebody who's like, it still takes a lot of work to do things with computers, but it's a different amount of work, and there's a different amount of the creator in that, I think. And I think that with retro, especially like you start seeing that retro aesthetic, the 8-bit, 16-bit pixel art for a lot of the indie games, which are done by small teams or one-person teams. And when you're looking at that, you know that the creator is very heavily involved with that, and everything that you're seeing was done for a very specific effect, and like had a lot of careful thought to it. Like I'm really into it, of course. So.
Some
Maybe that's why people go to the retro aesthetic is because they're seeking that intimacy and that type of form to kind of relate to their audiences, because there's maybe an absence of that or not enough of that.
Yeah.
It's great you bring up stop motion, because even the Leica stop motions, like Paranorman and Coraline, like those figurines have been 3D printed, but the clothes are sewn by hand, and so there's a lot of personality. So even though it is like mass produced, as you say, like I appreciate the artists do take the time to make it seem like it's not straight out of a factory.
Yeah.
Like the artist really has his work or her work imprinted.
Has everyone who cares about the new Star Wars film seen the new Star Wars film? Okay, I'm not going to say. Now I don't want to say the next thing I was going to say. Now, let's just say this. The difference between like the prequel Star Wars films where everything is CGI versus the original trilogy where everything is like a Muppet or a model. Very different tone, very different effect, very different impact, I think, on your viewing experience. And I think that the newer films are probably doing a balance of both of those things, but when you can see a model or like a puppet or something, then it evokes something different, and the newer films are evoking the original films more than the prequels did, I think, for a lot of people for that reason.
Absolutely.
I just wanted to add, talking about how people doing things by hand and whatnot, again, makes me think of Cuphead, where they literally drew every frame of animation on paper.
Yes, and you feel that.
Yes. It's why the animations in that game are so phenomenal, is because they didn't just take a computer and say, all right, move this here over half a second. They drew it moving over there, or they drew it rotating, or whatever else. That there is massive amount of blood, sweat, tears, and love that went into every single enemy you fight in that game.
When I find what's so extraordinary about Cuphead is it's not just the animation, the aesthetic permeates every decision they made. So, if Cuphead gets hit and he loses a life point, there's a crashing noise as if a cup has been chipped or broken. So it's totally immersing you. And even the recordings, they did something that it makes it sound like a recording from the late 20s, early 30s. They've got filters on it so that it looks like the old film reels. Like, they just went all the way to really immerse you into that world and make you feel the dream that you're actually in Cuphead fully.
So takeaway is, if you're going to commit to a retro aesthetic, commit.
Don't just like half-ass it.
Don't be like, I'm a 16-bit game, but I'm going to do other weird things.
I was playing the new River City Ransom Underground that came out, and The first thing, like out of the gate, I was disappointed that you had to use so many buttons on the controller. Like it actually, you start the game, it's like you should use a future controller. And like I actually had like a Nintendo controller plugged into my computer through like a USB adapter because I was like ready to play it. I was like, I don't have enough buttons. I need a shoulder button. I need 2 extra face buttons. I need like a trigger thing. I need all this stuff. And I was like, well, that's the button. The part for me, part of the retro aesthetic is like the simplicity of the play. And like being able to immerse myself in that instead of having to remember like these complicated like button combos and things like that for a game like that. And like they don't commit to like the sprite flickering and all that other stuff, but the game's broken for other reasons. It's like it's buggy, but I don't think those were intentional bugs. Like but it's just a different thing. Like that took me out of it. Like having to use a modern controller to play a game that felt very retro, like a game that I grew up with, like took me out of the experience a little bit.
That makes sense because you're like programmed a certain way. You know that like these are the ways that my finger would move in a certain context. So, yeah. So we've kind of talked about this a little bit, but I want to invite a little bit more conversation on this. So what do you guys think the retro aesthetic can do that photorealism or more contemporary aesthetics can't? Promising.
Yeah. No, there's definitely a lot to talk about there, I think. And I think at least one piece of that for me is the ability to create exaggerated motions. When I remember reading a book about how to do pixel art by actually somebody who's in the Miz room, and one of the first parts of that book was when you're doing an animation, make sure it's exaggerated so they don't just like throw out a punch, they wind back, throw out a punch, and they kind of like distend their entire body and distort it and like stretch it out a little bit, which allows it to feel really good when you do that. In a really good-looking 3D game, that looks weird. Looks like the physics are broken.
Unless you're playing Goat Simulator.
That game is deliberately broken, so And Cuphead is able to get away with that because it goes with the aesthetic of back in the day when distorting and stretching and bending was just part of the animation style. So you're able to play around with this stuff and do something that 3D would look weird with.
Or bad. Like if you're doing I think that as the modern games, like the technology improves, we're expecting things to look more and more realistic. And if you're doing something that isn't designed to be retro, but isn't good enough to compete with things that are coming out, today, then then people don't respond to that well. They just think that it's like poorly done, or it's cheaply made or whatever. So you either need to have like the money to do something that is going to pass muster, like the whole Uncanny Valley thing of like even now it's like look at an old Pixar movie, like look at Toy Story, and some of the people look horrific in those old movies, like if you're watching them, or like something like the Polar Express, which I cannot watch because that movie just gives me nightmares because the characters are just like really scary looking.
All Tom Hanks.
But now they've gotten so good that they can make something look like a person. You can make Carrie Fisher look like she did in 1978. Sort of. It didn't look that good to me. But you can try and get pretty close to it, But so sometimes I think going back to the retro aesthetic, it's like, well, if I intentionally am going for something that looks dated, or it'll be a little bit more forgiving, for my audience.
So there's actually 2 points out that you mentioned that I kind of bounce off a little bit. One kind of answers a little bit the earlier question of like, why is the retro aesthetic back in style? Because if somebody doesn't have the money to create AAA looking stuff, they go for something that will pass muster and people will look at it and say, I would like to play that, instead of, oh my gosh. The other is Toy Story is actually a really good example of using the limitations to your advantage, because the people look terrifying. The toys look awesome.
That's true.
And it's because they played with how plasticky those models looked and used it for something that worked. We were just watching it recently. We were just like, wow, this actually doesn't look as terrifying as we thought it would.
Sid gives me nightmares, but the rest of the toys,
Oh, gosh,
good.
Sid. Well, and I don't know why this occurred to me, but I think Undertale is a great example of taking advantage of a retro aesthetic to really recreate an experience because of how it uses those earthbound subversion of tropes and surprises. And it makes me think of when I was first playing games and I was just surprised by what a game could do. And just like, I was so immersed where I was like, wow, it feels so real and I didn't expect that to happen. And so I think if Undertale was in a more realistic aesthetic or a more contemporary aesthetic, I think I wouldn't necessarily emotionally resonate with it as much because it would emotionally distance it from me instead of making me go back to feeling like a kid picking up games for the first time.
So, I was going to say, that actually brings up, kind of goes a little bit back to what I said earlier of playing off of retro mechanics, where Undertale deliberately feels kind of like Earthbound because it was originally developed as a mod for Earthbound. And so if you've played Earthbound or know Earthbound, you immediately are like, ooh, this is interesting. This feels kind of like a game that I really enjoy. And you just get sucked right into that immediately because it plays with that idea. And then it does its own thing and does weird stuff that you don't expect as well, but it starts out and is like, this feels like something you know. And so you can enjoy that because of the kind of weirdness that it brings to the table that Earthbound does as well.
Some of it, I think, might be creators who like the retro games, like they grew up with them, but now they can do something in that style that feels like one of those games, but that can do more or do something differently, like you're saying, like it could be like playing with expectations. It's like, okay, well, I'm expecting this to be fairly limited experience, or I won't be able to do these things, but then they throw something at you that's like very surprising. And although it won't be retro for another 10 years, but like Breath of the Wild, I've seen reviewers, people talk about the game as it feels like the way they imagined the original Legend of Zelda was when they played that as a kid.
Yes.
You know, and it taps into a lot of the retro. It's not the aesthetic necessarily, but sort of like the themes and the style. Like somehow it captures that feeling without being retro, which is remarkable, I think. And I think that people who are doing something like Axiom Verge, it's like, well, what if Metroid were like even more awesome? You know, so let me make that game. You know, things like that. And like now they can apply modern technology, more storage space, better, you know, computer processing and all that stuff to create a game that is like that, but bigger and better and, you know, just more involved than it was.
So I kind of want to, sorry, go ahead.
Just real quick, there was a hand that I wanted to make sure to get. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Absolutely,
Yeah.
fantastic point.
An interesting point that the Game Theorist brought up in one of their videos about Undertale is that in the world of Undertale, the mechanics of the game are also the physics of the game. Like, that is how their universe works. And that, I think that's just a super interesting way of designing a game of like, oh, this is just how the universe works, is how a game works. And so you treat it like a game because that's how the universe also works. I also wanted to touch on Breath of the Wild, because you mentioned it feels like a retro game. Fun fact, they originally developed Breath of the Wild by creating a 2D game that looked a lot like the original Zelda, and prototyped all the mechanics in the game, and then when they were like, okay, we're satisfied with how fun this is, then they made it a 3D game and developed the rest of the game. So it feels retro because it originally was before it became 3D Breath of the Wild.
Yeah, and everybody wants them to release Zelda Maker. So they
Heck
you
yeah.
can make your own Zelda game. But now that you remind me of that, because I just saw like a rumor like this morning that like the next Zelda game is going to be on the 3DS pretty soon, and it's actually going to be kind of a remake of Link's Awakening, but closer to the Breath of the Wild aesthetic, or that feeling of the open world. And so it's kind of an interesting thing. If they can translate The Legend of Zelda into Breath of the Wild, what will they do with like Link's Awakening? You know.
Good
So,
question.
you know, if the rumor's true, but a lot of sources seem to say it is. So.
Did you want to say anything?
Oh no, I mean it's true. You're going in blind if you're starting something new, or if you're starting a new franchise. But there's so much history involved. Like if people playing Breath of the Wild knew that they wanted to get that cave experience that inspired the Zelda franchise, that history wasn't like that increase the enjoyability of the game. So knowing that there's so much history involved when you're creating something new, but that is inspired by retro aesthetics, I think is very important to keep in mind.
Yeah, and I don't know if this fully connects to the retro thing, but the idea of games being rooted in an experience like that, like exploring or Pokemon was inspired by the maker's experiences catching bugs as a kid. And so I think that that gives a heart to those games because it's rooted in something true and real. Yeah.
Pro tip, if you're going to make a game, base it off of something you love doing that maybe isn't based off of gaming.
Yeah.
Something you said just sparked another thought on why retro is kind of coming back into vogue. And I think that part of it might be filling a space in gaming that wouldn't otherwise exist. So as most modern like AAA game studios are making, really involved like RPGs or open world games or like first person games and things like that. For the longest time, like the only place that we couldn't get platform games. Like if you like platform games, you have to play the old platform games, And then for a while, like there was this like wonderful period on like the Game Boy Advance, I think like that era where you were getting more platform games. Like that sort of became its like niche for a little bit. And now a lot of the platform games and some of those like simple like JRPG influenced games are coming from indie studios, smaller studios. It's a game that's suitable to a small team making on a low budget with like just very limited constraints, but it's also filling a need for people who like that type of gaming. And I think the thing that you had said was something about coming into it and kind of knowing how to play it. Like if you have played a retro game in the past, like when you sit down, okay, well, I've got like a limited number of buttons and one of them's going to jump and one of them's going to be an action button and I use the directional pad to move around and then you can just play it as opposed to you come into something else which might have these really, something like, I don't know, like Xenoblade Chronicles 2 or something where you have to learn this like bizarre like game mechanic just to like get into it. Sometimes you just want to play a game and you want and it also feels like a need, at least in my life, for a very contained play experience.
Something familiar.
But also I know it's going to take me like, I can play for half an hour and put it down and come back to it later on and have had a satisfying game experience versus if I play half an hour of like an RPG or like Mass Effect, like I've maybe I made it through like one cinema sequence. Or maybe I got like a couple of lines of dialogue or something.
A 20-minute cinematic and like I'm done.
Right. It's like, well, the kid's crying, I gotta go.
Fiddled with your inventory for 20 minutes. Oh, there's the kid. Okay,
Right.
bye.
That's real. Well, do we have any other questions?
Or comments.
Yeah.
So this was kind of nodded to a couple of times, but I want to like just straight up address the topic.
Yeah.
A lot of the things that you guys were saying was that the older retro aesthetic is because it's cheaper and easier to produce, and I think that's kind of ties into indie game production. I feel like is this evidence enough that it's pretty high, and due to games being on computers and things like Steam, accessibility is really high. You don't have like the economic barrier. So do you think that all kind of ties into like people want to make the game designing easier so that the game can be produced by smaller groups? What are your thoughts on how retro affects budget?
It definitely can make a game cheaper to make because you don't need to invest as much time in assets, shaders, game logic, that sort of thing. That said, game design is still not going to be easy. It's just the tools that we have makes it easier over time to make games that are more and more complex or just get started. I mean, anybody in this room could go pick up Unity and make a simple tutorial game in a couple hours. It's not that hard these days to make something simple.
Do you think that might be part of why people are drawn to the retro aesthetics?
Yeah, I would say it is part of that because it's something that feels more achievable. If somebody as a hobby is going to go make a game, they're not going to make Resident Evil 7. Like they just don't have the skills and time necessary to make that game. It is very, very complicated, like way beyond anything that like probably most of the people, or if not anybody in this people know. Like even as a game, like somebody who's a programmer, I don't actually have all the requisite skills to make that game. But making a 2D platformer, way simpler. You can just pick up Game Maker, Unity, slap a few sprites on there, and run around.
Yeah, and you mentioned like Steam and sort of accessibility. I think that I don't know if that's something that they factor into it, but I think that's a nice bonus to it. Like you can get a new game that can play on your old PC. Like you don't need a high-end gaming PC to run something. You can play it on your phone. Like a lot of these things get adapted to like every platform imaginable because they can, because they're simple enough, and that broadens your audience. And if you're making games because you want people to play them, then that's a really nice thing, because then that's not people aren't limited to only playing it on the brand new Xbox that does 4K stuff.
They can also make a wider range of games if you're sticking to something with a simpler art style. I'm thinking something like Pony Island, which is kind of a weird meta game, or Undertale, which is kind of a weird meta game. Like, making something like Undertale that looks like Resident Evil 7, not going to happen because it's too risky.
Well, for real, Toby Fox made Undertale.
Yeah.
Like on his own, and Temmie doing some things.
Yeah. So I mean, you just have the capability to do a broader range of things that look retro when you go for that, or maybe you spend 10 years making Owlboy. Like, yeah.
Possibilities are endless.
Yeah.
Yes.
I feel like, I agree that it kind of helps manage bias or facilitate that suspension of disbelief. I kind of see a parallel between, like, if I'm looking at a still life painting versus an impressionist, like, I'm not bringing that bias where I'm looking for what's quote-unquote wrong, or what's, like, not accurate, but what's being expressed in that world or in that context. Like, I'm not going to look at a Van Gogh and be like, that doesn't look like a whatever. That's not how color works. In this world, yes, it does, and this is how it feels and how it looks, and things like that. And it's that believability / plausibility versus realism.
Think about all the people who made effect of the faces in Mass Effect Andromeda, or all the videos of all the weird glitchy physics in the Elder Scrolls games. Like, takes you right out if you're even slightly immersed.
Yes.
On that note, I think it's also like for a player, like looking at it and like deciding how they feel about it, it's like a measure of are they thinking, or are they deciding based on the technique, how good the technique is, which with realism I feel like there's gonna be a lot of it, like the Mass Effect Andromeda thing. It's like they're taken out of it and they're like their complaints are gonna be a lot about, well, it doesn't look right. Whereas with a retro game, I feel like I'd be more inclined to look at the creativity of how they used it. So that's how I would sort of measure how creative they got with it versus how technically skilled they are.
Yeah, I think about how people judge a game's quality based on how good it looks now. So like I was kind of joking about the new Xbox. You've got like a PS4, like multiple versions of the PS4, multiple versions of the Xbox that all have better graphics, but there aren't any games that are really taking advantage of that yet. But people are kind of lulled into like they lure it in by, oh well, it's fancier, or it has more processing power, or whatever, so it must be better. And yet the Switch is outselling. Like I think they just announced that it's like the fastest selling console in the U.S. history. But
More than the PS2, by the way.
Say again?
More than the PS2, if I remember correctly.
Which is amazing, and it's because and it's the least powerful system that you can get. It's like 720p, which, oh my God, like people are like, oh my God, 720p, like how can you bear to look at that horrific, resolution?
So retro.
But it's like, and a lot of retro games are coming out on the Switch, like that aesthetic. Yeah. But I think I think that retro games emphasize the gameplay and the invention of them, like the game mechanics, more than they do how good the game looks. And like even the Wii was like really the underpowered system at the time too, and yet it had a fresh mechanic. It had really interesting games. Like the reason I buy Nintendo systems is because I love Nintendo games, and I can only play Nintendo games on Nintendo systems. Like the other games, like I play lots of newer games too, but I can do that on a PC, or I could buy a new system or whatever. But like I'm constantly drawn to the Nintendo games because there's a certain amount of like joy in them, and they're just more fun. You get some different kind of experience with something like Skyrim, which you can now also play on a Nintendo system. But you have to be in a different mood, and you have to have you have to be going into it for a different reason. You want to be immersed in this game for like 200 hours or whatever. For me, I like picking up a game and playing it for like 5 minutes if I have 5 minutes.
I like that some people start referring to the Switch as the indie game console.
Yeah, but everyone wants to play things on it. Every time something comes out, it's like, is it coming out on the Switch? Like, there's also part of it's the convenience of being able to take it with you or whatever. But it's definitely, there's like a ton of indie games, and I have, there's games that I would have gotten on Steam to play on my PC. I'm like thinking, well, maybe I should get it on the Switch instead,
Actually, I saw people playing Switch in the hallway. Do I see people playing Xbox in the hallway? No.
If you do, let's all go point and laugh.
If you can do that, I'll so much respect.
Yes.
No, that definitely rings true to me, and I'm thinking of what's the game where you're a guy who can use electricity because of some weird bomb that went off?
Yeah.
Infamous, yeah. Chain link fences are the bane of that character. He's basically a god, and he can't go through a chain link fence. That's in the history of games. It's a pretty common complaint of like, there's this tiny bit of rubble and I can't go through it. I have a giant hammer. I can leap over all these things. Why can't I go through this tiny thing? I have to go through this huge circuitous route instead of going over the tiny wall.
Hedges.
Yeah.
Only weakness.
I know, right? I'm Reinhardt and I can't go through a hedge. What's up with that?
Any other thoughts, feels?
About relatability or like realism versus aesthetic.
Yeah, the realism can pull you out of the game
Limit
if it
what you can do.
limit what you can do. Yeah.
Well, I think that process of like striving for realism, I think that it can be a pretty fruitless endeavor sometimes, because as Eugene mentioned, there is the issue of Uncanny Valley, for instance, and if you strive to I need the best technology to have this, I need to have that technology in order to convey my message or whatever aesthetic I'm trying to get across, you run the risk of coming up with an aesthetic that's not yours. Mm-hmm. And so you run the risk of being dependent on whatever technology you're limited to.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think maybe related to that, sort of like a suspension of disbelief, like almost any platform game. Like if you had a platform game where your character could only jump like the height that any one of us could legitimately jump, like that would be a terrible platformer. I think there are some games like that where like your height is very limited, but I think somebody had calculated how high Mario could actually jump. It was like the real world, and it's like, but he's just supposed to be a guy, right? Until he takes a mushroom or something. Yeah, it's interesting. Like you're giving up, you're suspending a lot of disbelief in favor of like buying into a play experience for a certain effect, So there was a comment back there,
Yeah, so do you think like the retro aesthetic or nostalgia ever limits games? So people are trying to recreate some game they played 20 years ago, and it comes out and it's either limited to fans of that game from 20 years ago, it doesn't get like a wider appeal, or it's just you go back and you play and you realize this game 20 years ago wasn't that good.
Actually, when you say that, that makes me think of some of the reboots of old games.
Yeah, like reboots.
Yeah.
HD remakes that are still in like 4:3 aspect ratio for some reason.
So one personally that's driven me bonkers is I got the new Fire Emblem Echoes of Valencia, and I binge every Fire Emblem's game. But this one drives me bonkers because it feels like it was pretty much like, yeah, we're going to recreate the first one and we're not going to add any innovations that made those games better. We're just going to go back to the first one because first one and leave all the things that were bad about old Fire Emblem games in there. I mean, that's my personal opinion. Maybe some people would enjoy it, but it felt like that might be an example of where they just recopied something for the sake of nostalgia, as opposed to how can we make this game the best it can be.
Specifically, she's complained about things like having to fly over this specific area with this specific character to unlock this specific door, or
When
kill.
there's no implication that that's what you're supposed to do, or the grinding in. They add these like dungeon crawling things where you have to grind, and then you grind for like an hour, and then like, oh lol, here's some currency that you still can't use anywhere. So there's like no value to the item that I just got and worked hard for. And I feel like it's frustrating as opposed to difficulty for the sake of like being satisfying, of mastering something. It's more like, gosh, why did I just waste my time doing that, and I never want to go in a dungeon again.
I would say that if you're going to make a game with a retro aesthetic, you are definitely limiting yourself to probably a specific audience usually. That's not always the case. I guess Terraria and Stardew Valley have hit mass appeal, but most games that are made in a retro style are probably not going to hit mass appeal because there's probably a narrow slice of gamers that are like, I remember either this game that it's based off of or this time period where I'm very nostalgic for. Kids like 10-year-old is probably going to look at your game and be like, well, why doesn't it look like RE7? Like, that doesn't look appealing to me.
I don't understand it.
Yeah, this isn't nostalgic for me, so I don't care. You're probably aiming at like 30-year-old people who played Super Metroid or Earthbound or something like that. And sometimes you'll get past that, but that's an exception rather than a rule, and you can probably count on one hand the number of games that do that. So it is limiting audience. I don't know if necessarily mechanically you're going to limit yourself because you can really do whatever you want, other than like you can't do 3D graphics if you're doing a 2D game.
I'm trying to think about a game that's actually like within the retro aesthetic that it enforces specific limitation on it. So I mentioned Mega Man 9 before, and I don't know if you guys have played it, but I mean that's like came out like 10 years ago. I actually only just beat it for the first time finally. I've been stuck in the last level for like a decade, and I keep coming back to it, and I play for like a couple days, and then it's too hard, and I stop. And then the next time I come back to it, I have to relearn how to play those levels again. It's taken me 10 years, like legitimately. But Mega Man 9 intentionally went back to, so over the course of the Mega Man games, even through the ones that are just on the NES, from Mega Man 1 through 6, like Mega Man gained new abilities. He learned the ability to slide. He could charge up his Mega Buster to have these like larger projectiles. And Mega Man 9 intentionally limited him to the abilities he had in Mega Man 2. And you could like get DLC to do some of the other stuff if you really wanted to. But a lot of people thought that was like going too far. Like it's too hard. It's a really hard game. It's like probably the hardest like 8-bit style Mega Man game that you could play. And then if you go beyond that to like the Mega Man X games and some of the other iterations, like he's learned how to do wall jumps and all this other cool stuff. And none of that was reflected in that game. So in that sense, it's a throwback that feels really retro. It felt like something that could have been made back then, but is that a good thing? Only really the hardcore Mega Man fans will play it, even if it takes them 10 years to beat it. And then Mega Man 10 kind of like took a step back from that a little bit, but then it was also apparently just not very good. And then I was thinking about like a retro aesthetic, like you were talking about like remakes. And so the Metroid 2 just came out, like the remake of Metroid 2. Samus Returns instead of the Return of Samus, and that is like in some senses they've improved on the original game. Like it's easier to navigate. There's like an auto map, but they've also like added a bunch of stuff to it, so you can now fire in like 8 directions. And there's like the one thing that I've seen people complain the most about is like there's this new melee combat feature to it, which is kind of irritating because you come across. I haven't actually played it yet, but my wife is playing it. Every encounter you make with an enemy, you have to essentially like attack them at close quarters in order to weaken them first, and then you can like shoot them and do all this other stuff, and that kind of slows the game down. So it fixes some of the things from the old game, but it also introduces some new things that maybe modern players, like the reason you do a remake is you're trying to bring new gamers to like an old series, but it also can turn off people who like that original thing.
Yeah.
So it's like a balance. You have to figure out what are you going for, what audience is this for, and like really think about it. And just updating it to modern technology or to meet new expectations isn't necessarily a good thing. just as like slavishly like adhering to the original limitations isn't necessarily a good thing.
Or if you try and remake it faithfully and get it just slightly wrong, Crash Bandicoot, and all of a sudden it becomes more frustrating because something about it isn't quite what it should be, and it stops being balanced in the same way that the original game was.
On the other hand, they can still consistently make bad Bubsy games. So.
Oh my
That's
gosh.
always the truth.
When will it stop?
This game sucks. Perfect. Good job, guys.
That's what we were expecting.
Yeah.
One thing I find really interesting is there recently made what they called a demake of this game Lucius, which was originally like 3D, and you were the Antichrist walking around. But they made like a weird more like not 8-bit, but like a retro-y version of it.
Demakes are pretty cool and have been around for a long time. There is probably a little-known game that even I forgot about, and I played it. Demake of Half-Life 2 called Codename Gordon that came out. I don't remember if it was exactly at the same time that Half-Life 2 did, but it was a 2D side-scrolling platforming version of the game that had the gravity gun, crowbar, and everything. So, demakes have been a long tradition. I mean, there's officially licensed ones, Odin Sphere, Borderlands 2, Serious Sam has 2 quote-unquote demakes, the RPG one and the side-scrolling one where you can stack guns on top of guns, make a 16-barreled shotgun or whatever, I don't know. But demakes are really cool because it allows you to explore a game. It allows you to explore the game's mechanics in kind of a new way because you're working with different limitations. So, like the Left 4 Dead demake that was done, it looks like an NES game, and there's like only 1 or 2 zombies on screen at any one time, and you have the tiny little UI on the bottom, and the way like boomers work are totally different because they run at you and trying to explode, and it like only has a little tiny area, and I think it just damages you. I don't know if it causes zombies to run at you. So you're approaching the same game with different limitations and trying to figure out how to create something that is interesting to play in a totally different form.
It's a fun challenge, I would think.
Oh yeah. Halo had a demake that was a GBA game, basically.
Cool. Yes.
I wonder if classifying something as like or doing it in a retro style kind of speaks to like a lot of these retro games have staying power. Like you go back and play this game because there's something else with the abstraction or something besides the cutting edge graphics because it's changed, and that's why we have so many makes of like this year's edition of FIFA or whatever because the graphics keep updating. But why would you go back to the previous one? Like, why would I go back to a Mario platformer on the N64? Because there's something there that like, the graphics are fun, but that's not why I'm going back. And I feel like going the abstract route kind of cleans you up and sort and kind of, make the core really good to get that good nugget of fun. That's, really at the heart of why you go back. And 20 years later, why it has staying power.
Well, and I think you're making a great point in there of the aesthetic shouldn't be the sole reason you're making something. That should be just reinforcing the heart of what you're making. And I think that sometimes there's a danger, like right now with this being a trend of retro aesthetics, that some people are like, well, I'm going to make it in 8-bit because 8-bit's popular or whatever. So, yeah, whatever form you're using should be reinforcing content.
There's a reason Wind Waker still looks good to this day, and the HD remake looks basically the same. slightly brighter because Bloom or something. And why Super Metroid is still one of my favorite games of all time, and I still think it is a gorgeous game.
It's also if you're trying to make a certain type of game, then you almost are maybe not limited, but your natural inclination would be make it look like a retro game. So if you have something like Thimbleweed Park, I'm actually just playing Maniac Mansion for the first time, like on the NES, and I've seen a friend play through Thimbleweed Park, and it's like very similar. But if you were going to do a point and click kind of adventure like that today with like modern graphics, I guess you could probably do that, but it would look kind of weird. I think,
Yeah.
right? It would feel off. It would feel strange, maybe.
There's something about the spirit.
You know,
of
but
it
it's
that
like
we
this is
lost,
like
yeah.
it's a mouse. You know, you're clicking around with a mouse in like with like character. I don't know. It would be like playing The Sims, maybe. Maybe you could do like a Sims kind of version of Thimbleweed Park that with characters like that. I don't know. But you know, the part of that game, like the challenge is that you're on this like flat plane, and you have to figure out what you can interact with and what's you know, what's useful and how to move around and things like that. I actually was just asking. I'm also playing through Metroid for the first time on the NES. I know I could play Zero Mission, which is like the updated version of that, which people love, and it has like auto mapping and everything. But I wanted to do that. I wanted to go through the actual experience of like drawing my own map and being lost and like trying to find my way through it. And I'm trying to think about how, if there are any games now that do that, where you actually have to like draw stuff and write things down to remember them outside of the game. Like most games have it all kind of baked into it. Like you've got this auto map, or at least you can see a portion of the map or something like that. And if somebody made a game where you had to legitimately draw a map to navigate it, like Goonies 2 or something. I don't know.
Etrian Odyssey.
Can you?
I don't think it has. It may have partial auto mapping, but you have to make your own map. And like, I remember a friend of mine beat it, and he said that one of the dungeons you're in has teleporters. So you actually have to draw where each teleporter goes to on your map in order to figure out how to actually get through that. So there's like, and there's like specific areas with events, and so you have to write down which enemies drop what when you do certain things, and like there's a ton of information you actually need to do outside of the game or in the like in-game like build your own map interface with like you can put markers down and whatnot in order to play it well.
One of the DS Zelda games you could actually draw on the map, which is kind of neat.
But yeah, Phantom Hourglass.
Yes,
Yeah,
that was
that's
super cool.
That's pretty cool.
There's actually an island in that game that has no map, and you have to do it entirely yourself.
That's awesome. I must have gone to that island. I did beat that game, but
Yeah.
I don't remember that part of it. Anyway.
I think we have time for one more question. Were there any others? Yeah.
What do you guys think of roguelikes and basically games where the graphics are just ASCII characters?
I love games that are ASCII characters. Kind of. I've actually tried to play Dwarf Fortress in original ASCII before. It's hard, but at some point you see the Matrix and it just makes sense, you know. I think those games are cool. I also do enjoy the games that are roguelike but aren't just ASCII. Games like Dungeons of Dreadmore, which is apparently a legitimately really good roguelike game. Or even FTL, which is, I guess, technically a roguelite. But there's a whole lot of takes on that, and I think that those kind of games are super cool. But ASCII games are cool. You shouldn't, if you want to make a game that's purely ASCII, go for it. I think that would be an interesting thing to do. I mean, there's one actually being made right now. I can't remember the name of it. There's a current roguelike being made that is just ASCII characters, and it's a sci-fi one where you're in a like a space like ship thing, and you can hack other stuff. Cogmind. Cogmind is a game that is currently in development. I think it's going to be released soon. That is ASCII art, but it's like really good ASCII art, so it looks really, really cool, and it does cool stuff with the roguelike ideas in order to make it like really interesting to look at. So you're not just looking at a bunch of semicolons or something. So games are still doing that. Cogmind about to come out sometime soon, I think.
Cool. Any final thoughts that we want to share with the audience?
You have all of our thoughts on this particular topic.
Well, thank you so much, guys, for coming. And if you've got additional questions or just want to chat with us, we'll stay around for a couple more minutes. We've got some swag. We've got some books you can check out. So thank you again for coming.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah.